goes from here on the outside to here underneath. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone. This is the squamous part. A prominent feature of the temporal bone is this large projection, the mastoid process. As we'll see, it's the origin of some of the muscles that move the head, including the sternocleidomastoid. It's easy to feel the mastoid process here, behind and below the ear. While we're getting introduced to the temporal bone, we'll take a first look at some of its other important features, which we'll appreciate in later sections of these two tapes. We'll also meet some of the small openings through which important blood vessels, nerves, and other structures enter and leave the cranium. There are many of these openings. Here, we'll just look at the openings on the outside of the temporal and occipital bones. This is the zygomatic arch, formed largely by the temporal bone and partly by the adjoining zygomatic bone. Here on the underside of the root of the zygomatic arch, this complex curved surface articulates with the condyle of the mandible to form the temporomandibular joint. This is the external auditory meatus leading to the middle ear. This long, sharp projection is the styloid process. Just at the base of the styloid is the little stylomastoid foramen for the facial nerve. Medial to the styloid process are...
Okay, guys, look at this area. This is the mastoid process. This is the mastoid notch for origination of posterior belly of the gastric, and this is the occipital groove for passing the occipital artery.
Two major openings for blood vessels. The carotid canal passing forwards for the internal carotid artery, and the jugular foramen passing backwards for the internal jugular vein. Just above the occipital condyle is the hypoglossal canal for the hypoglossal nerve.
Another bone is the ethmoid bone. Please look at the green bone. This is the ethmoid bone. It's located anterior to sphenoid bone and forms the medial wall of orbital cavity and forms the nasal septum and lateral wall of nasal cavity. This is the schematic picture of ethmoid bone. This bone consists of three parts: perpendicular plate, here, or vertical plate, horizontal plate, here, or cribriform plate. Because the horizontal plate has a mount foramina for passing olfactory nerves from the roof of nasal cavity. So the name of horizontal plate is cribriform plate. Another part of ethmoid bone are two lateral masses. It has two lateral masses. Actually, the lateral masses form the medial border of medial wall of orbital cavity and lateral wall of nasal cavity, because this is the nasal cavity, left and right, and this is orbital cavity. The lateral surface of lateral mass has a smooth and other name of this part is lamina propria. Lamina propria is a smooth layer of bone and forms the medial wall of orbital cavity. Lamina propria. This is the crista galli. Actually, the crista galli is the upper projection of perpendicular plate and is located between cribriform plate in anterior cranial fossa. In this picture, you can see ethmoid bone. It's a yellow bone. Is located in ethmoidal notch between frontal plate of orbital plate of frontal bone. This is the ethmoid bone. It's located between frontal bone and sphenoid bone. And this is the cribriform or horizontal plate contain of amount of foramina. At the anterior, you can see the ethmoid bone horizontal plate has a two wing and attached to frontal crest and form the foramen cecum between this structure. Foramen cecum is a foramen between the frontal crest and horizontal plate of ethmoid bone. This is the lateral mass. Lateral mass has two conchi, superior conchi and middle conchi. And another conchi as the inferior conchi is a independent, as a dependent bone in the facial skeleton. It's not belong to ethmoid bone. There is a superior meatus between superior and middle conchi. There is a middle meatus between middle and inferior conchi, and there is an inferior meatus inferior to inferior nasal conchi. This meatus is placement for drain of paranasal sinus in nasal cavity. And in the next week, I will explain about the nasal cavity and paranasal sinus. This is the ethmoid bone. You can see a lateral mass here. Lateral mass contain of air cell, anterior, middle, and posterior ethmoidal air cell. In the lateral, form the medial wall of orbital cavity, and it has a smooth area or lamina propria. And in the medial, form the lateral wall of nasal cavity. And you can see a vertical plate or perpendicular plate forms the nasal septum in nasal cavity, and at the posterior inserted to vomer bone. And the nasal septum is completed with the ethmoid bone and vomer bone. This is the crista galli, is the upper projection of perpendicular plates. Look at this video for ethmoid bone.
Before we go further, we need to catch up on something that with the section, ethmoid bone, is part. Now, look at the openings of it, is a skull that was divided, back to the skull that was divided in the frontal plane. All of this is the ethmoid bone. This part, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, forms a large part of the bony nasal septum. This upward projection is the beginning of the crista galli, which rises up in the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. On each side of the crista galli are the cribriform plates, which we've seen already from above and from below. The most lateral part of the ethmoid bone is this paper-thin layer, the lamina papyracea, which forms this part of the medial wall of the orbit. Between the lamina papyracea and the upper part of the nasal cavity are the ethmoid air cells, as we've seen. The superior and middle conchae are also parts of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is joined to the frontal bone above, the maxillae below, and the central part of the sphenoid bone behind.
Okay. Do you have a question about temporal and ethmoidal bone? Okay, thank you. You have 5 minutes for a break. After the 5 minutes, please come back to class and I will explain about mandible and maxillary bone. You're welcome. Okay, guys, if you are ready, please answer this question. Which structure is not seen on anterior surface of petrous part of temporal bone? A. Trigeminal impression. B. Carotid canal. C. Tegment tympani. D. Arcuate eminence. Please answer the question. Don't type in the public chat, please. Select the choice A, B, C, D. I told you petrous part of temporal has a three surface, anterior, posterior, and inferior surface. Which structure is not seen on anterior surface? Carotid canal is not seen on anterior surface. All of you has a mistake because trigeminal impression, tegment tympani, and arcuate eminence. All of them is located on anterior surface of petrous. Okay, another bone is a maxillary bone. Maxillary bone is a facial skeletal bones, and it has a body and four process: frontal process, zygomatic process, alveolar process, and palatine process in roof of oral cavity. This is the body of maxillary bone. On the body, there is a foramen. It's called infraorbital foramen because it's located inferior to orbital cavity, and this foramen for passing the infraorbital nerve and vessels. And each maxillary bone near the midline inserted two opposite maxillary bone, and at the midline form the anterior nasal spine. This is the anterior nasal spine or nasal spine. Is formed by left and right maxillary bone. And there is a nasal notch or preform fossa is here in the body of maxillary bone. And on the alveolar process, you can see eminence from the teeth. The eminence for canine tooth is more prominent compared to other prominence for root of teeth. This is the posterior surface of maxillary bone because the body of maxilla has a anterior surface, posterior surface, and superior surface. This is anterior and this is posterior surface is separated by zygomatic process. On the posterior surface, you can see alveolar canal for passing posterior superior alveolar vessels and nerve. And behind the third molar teeth or molar tooth, there is a tuberosity. This is the maxillary tuberosity is located behind the last molar tooth. This is the medial surface of maxillary bone. In the medial surface, there is a hiatus, a large hiatus for location of maxillary sinus, and you can see a nasolacrimal canal is here on the medial surface of body. So the maxillary bone of maxillary bone contain of four surface: anterior surface, superior surface, posterior, and medial surface. The superior surface of maxillary bone forms the floor of orbital cavity and is separated by a sphenoid bone by the fissure. The name of fissure is infraorbital fissure. The maxillary bone has a four process: frontal process, zygomatic process, alveolar process, and palatine process. This is the palatine process. It's here. Frontal process is located between nasal bone and lacrimal bone. This is the frontal process. And on the frontal process, there is an anterior lacrimal crest. On the lacrimal bone, there is a posterior lacrimal crest. And this depression is location for lacrimal sac for saving the secretion of lacrimal gland. So the frontal process of maxillary bone is located between nasal bone and lacrimal bone. This is a zygomatic process connected to zygomatic bone. This is the alveolar process contain of 16 socket for root of 16 teeth. And this is a palatine process, forms the roof of oral cavity and floor of nasal cavity. On the superior surface, there is a intermaxillary suture on the palatine surface, and at the posterior is attached to palatine bones, the blue bone. On the roof of oral cavity, on palatine process, you can see intermaxillary suture between the left and right palatine process, and there is a fossa as an incisive fossa behind the central incisive teeth. And from this incisive fossa connected to incisive canal to nasal cavity, and this foramen and canal for passing the nerve and vessel between the nasal cavity and oral cavity. Zohre Karimi, the right answer is carotid canal, because I ask you which of the structure is not seen on anterior surface of petrous part, and the carotid canal is right because carotid canal is located the inferior surface of petrous portion. So please look at this video for maxillary bone.
Now that we've looked at the shape of, see how largest the maxilla, the sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone. The frontal bone is a very large bone. The lower part of the frontal bone forms the beginning of the root of the nose, the upper part of the orbital margin, a small part of the temporal fossa, and a large part of the roof of the orbit. The frontal bone also forms most of the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. The part of the frontal bone near the midline is hollow. The hollow space is the frontal sinus, one of the The zygomatic bone forms the bony prominence of the cheek. It also forms the lower lateral part of the orbital margin and this part of the lateral orbital wall. The zygomatic bone extends backward to meet the zygomatic process. Now we'll move forward and look at the maxilla. Here's the maxilla. The right and left maxillae are joined together in the midline. On each side, the maxilla forms the lower medial part of the orbital margin.
The maxilla has a body and four processes. This is the body, has a four surface, anterior surface, superior surface, medial surface, and posterior surface. And it has a four process: frontal process, zygomatic process, alveolar process, and palatine process.
And almost all of the floor of the orbit. The maxilla bears the upper teeth.
This is the posterior surface of body.
On the underside, it forms much of the hard palate. The maxilla is hollow. It contains the largest of the paranasal sinuses, the maxillary sinus. To see the posterior part of the maxilla, we'll remove the zygomatic arch. Here's the back of the hollow part of the maxilla. Down here, the maxilla is joined to the bone behind it, the sphenoid bone. Apart from this attachment, the maxilla...
The name of fissure between the sphenoid and maxilla is a trigomaxillary fissure. Trigomaxillary fissure is the name of this fissure. It's located between sphenoid or trigoid plate and maxillary.
It is separated from the sphenoid by this impressive cleft, which has a vertical part and a horizontal part. The vertical part of the cleft is called the pterygomaxillary fissure. The horizontal part of the cleft is called the inferior orbital fissure. The inferior orbital fissure, here it is from in front, separates the floor of the orbit, formed by the maxilla, from the lateral wall that's formed by the sphenoid.
Yes, the first beginning of the video is about frontal. After that, explain the maxillary. Your reference book for study the head of neck is Gray Anatomy. Gray for a student is your reference for study. And the last bone for today is a mandible. The mandible bone forms the lower jaw as a single bone and is just the mobile bone in the skull, and it has a body and ramus, two ramus and body. This is the body and this is the ramus, left and right ramus. There is the angle between the ramus and body is called angle of mandible, and in the body you can see anterior surface of body, and at the midline there is a symphysis of Menti. Is a remnant place for attaching of body in the mandible, because in embryological duration the mandible is separated and are pair bone, but is attached this location, and forms the symphysis of